Доброго ранку усім гостям. Доброго ранку.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody who is online with us. We start this day with the discussion. The doors of NATO for Ukraine closed or open. We have Tachynska senior partner, Alyona Getmanchuk, New Europe Agency, Nova Europa, Sergiy Getmanchuk, and Kateryna Zarembo, Deputy Director of Nova Europa Center. I give floor to Tamara Tachynska. Floor is yours. Good morning. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues, for gathering here. Today we are happy to present the sixth quarterly of TRUMAN Index. Again, I remind you this is evaluation of political relations between Russia, USA, European Union, and China, and Ukraine, of course. Again, today we present you the new relations, the new issue on relations between Ukraine and NATO, since our speakers are already introduced. Our experts introduced recently the authors of our studies, Ms. Getmanchuk, our expert from the USA, Ms. Zarembo from NATO, and Mr. Sergiy Solodkyy. He is responsible for Russian line of activity. Briefly about our methodology of our study. So, we evaluate all the events, 3-4 months, with a scale of -10 + 10 score. So of course the highest score will be assigned to the biggest positive processes, and the deep minus is for provocation or breach of diplomatic relations. And TRUMAN Index, it's actually the sum of scores of all the events divided by the number of such events. As I already mentioned, the new direction of our activity, it's Ukraine NATO. So we calculated TRUMAN Index for this activity. So I briefly introduce you to all the TRUMAN indexes for all the directions of our activity, starting with the USA. Please give us the info. You may see here, you have this in your handouts. We shown you how TRUMAN Index fluctuated in our latest period. Today, as of today, it is equal to 1.5. You may understand that it is increasing because our level of cooperation is improving. Because we are judging the quality of our negotiations, and if any positive output we have, then the index will goes up to plus. So we have very interesting periods of our studies, and I'd like to ask Kateryna Getmanchuk to make comments on one of the features here. So we're speaking about not the struggle of Ukraine to deserve support from the USA, because but to support it materially or financially. So thank you, Tamara. Thank you for squeeze this multi-paged report transform into 3 theses, actually. And of course, if you go deeper into details for each idea, then they are much more broader or deeper than here. But as for the support, as for buy of the USA support, we are speaking about the fact that for a long time, Ukraine in American line of activity, relations with America, Ukraine attempted to get support from the USA free of charge, because it was a notion that USA is interested to support Ukraine per se, or because it's national interest of the USA itself, or to support Ukrainian reforms, which is again in the scope of interest for the USA. And of course, in the USA, in the Washington, and in the leading agencies, there are a lot of partners supporting Ukraine, and reforms, of course, for them means a lot. For instance, anti-corruption reform, it's a very important thing for them, and they trying to be very harsh on persuading this aim of chasing this aim, or struggling to get it. And within this last quarter, statements and even articles of congressmen and high officials of the USA, ex-officials, acting officials, they were very interested in anti-corruption issues, interested in creation of anti-corruption court. This is very tightly related to e-declaring of the income of anti-corruptive activists, and this is a nonsense, because, and even our partners supported that, within the last quarter there's a new trend when being oriented toward business background of Donald Trump, taking into account the relations between the acting administration in the USA and the European or other countries. They are trying to go into certain agreements or contracts, and thus they, so to say, purchase the goodwill of American president. And probably it's not that bad. It's one of the ways how to draw attention to yourself, how to say, go deeper into the heart of many people that are already support Ukraine, the people that understand Ukraine as an important nation for the USA, but not only for them, but for the people that are oriented towards business relations. I mean, President Trump and his supporters, his surrounding. So we have already mentioned the purchase of American coal, and we have already announced the General Electric deal on the modernization of Ukrzaliznytsia, the locomotion, the locomotives of Ukrzaliznytsia. And as a prospect to create job within that deal in Ukrainian territory, and to start producing ourselves the same General Motors items. So we are reconsidering recently the fact that Ukraine not only should love foreign investments, but it should love foreign investors as well. And of course, we have a desire to be involved in the focus of attention of President Trump until he is president, and to create proper opportunities, background for investors, not only from the USA, but from other countries as well, and to improve business climate thus. Only one phrase I would like to say. Lethal weapons, providing, say, selling lethal weapons to Ukraine. This is very important, and this decision was made within last quarter. But this is specifically the case where we should apply the business saying that money loves quiet attention, not to announce everything, not to open or reveal everything. So thank you, Alyona, for your comments. Our next activity, by the way, we will have Q&A session, and you will be able to ask Alyona on everything. And finally we have coffee, and you will have informal networking. So now next direction is China, and until now we probably the only one who are studying this thoroughly, and due to our thanking to our authors, you will be able to learn a lot. So what do we see here. In principle, Chinese index is stable. It amounts up to 0.93 now. It's quite an exotical issue for Ukraine. In many cases, you may understand in our magazine, reading it, that we are trying to penetrate deeper into culture specifics of each other, of the nations. And again, the number of economical contacts is growing up, and China is ready to invest around $7.5 billion in Ukrainian agrarian, innovation, alternative energy projects, etc. Last year, the Naftogaz credit from China failed to be injected in our country. But China, we know it for sure that they are interested to cooperate with the energy sector of Ukraine, and specifically with the Naftogaz. So we'll be follow up this story and these relations, because China is very interesting direction of our studies for us, because we have a lot of new opportunities there. Our next activity is Russia, and of course it is obviously that TRUMAN index is negative. I may remind you that we have provocations, we have combat actions. We put them into the minus part of the scale. So now we have minus 1.3. It is higher than 1 year ago, and it amounted to 4.6, but lower than a quarter before. Again, we revealed some new traces, and I would like to ask Sergiy Solodkyy, our author of this study. Of course, this index is very interesting, and it will be very interesting for us to calculate something else, paying attention to the relations between us and Russia. What are the most important trends lately, and what Putin played as a game lately? Thank you. I give some comments to TRUMAN index for you not to understand that we improved our relations with Russia within a year. No, of course not. And probably de facto war with Russia plays its role, or say gives the methodological decline of our index, because we could put minus 10 every day, because we are not only evaluate here, we incorporated in this last figure not only war actions but other events. So not only war, because 1 year ago it was Hague court sitting on the situation around Avdiivka, considering the fact that Russia recognized documents issued by Ordlo. This period was as well very rich for events, and the average level of score was -7. So what was the most characteristic of the last period? One is Putin tried to impose himself or as peacemaker, or get it image, and it was kind of an illusion for our Western partners that Putin is ready maybe to go into compromises, but our Western partners, they kept saying that they're not that naive. So in the beginning they were very skeptical, and of course we had kind of a deadline of our expectations that finally the West will see that the presidential election in Russia will end up in Putin, and nevertheless the peacekeeping line will not be rectified or improved. So, and it will lead us to increase sanctions or deepen them against Russia. So Mr. Putin, he demonstrated readiness for peacekeeping mission or peacekeeping forces application. But he only demonstrated that. And next event, the free of Ukrainian hostages, or say swap of them. And of course, it was not kind of a compromise, it was half compromise. Some steps, and those steps never led to serious actions towards the mitigation or decrease of escalation level, not only for Ukraine but on a global area. And Ukraine tried to mitigate sanctions. It tried to as well work in the PASE, or Parliament Assembly of Council of Europe, and in one hand, diplomacy overestimated their abilities, their power, and underestimated of other delegations. The British delegation was most supportive for Ukrainian delegation in PACE, and last month it was Britain that was the epicenter of new sanction steps against Russia. Taking this as a process, and of course we're speaking about increased sanctions or deepened sanctions, not because Russia don't want to be involved in any negotiations more substantially, but because Russia is very tough in doing anything, and Britain, they answered with very harsh sanctions and relations towards Russia. So next report of ours will be even more interesting. Speaking of non-preparedness of West to demonstrate its integrity and tough position against Russia, and for Ukraine it could be considered as not very clear signal, because in many cases we're speaking about diplomats that were expulsioned, and in other hand, in the background of diplomacy in Ukraine, Germany decided to allow Russia to start building Northern Stream 2. So then they decided that it could be done. Thank you, Sergiy. Next activity is our traditional activity, is European Union. So as you may see here, in the last half year, this index remains stable around 1.8, 1.86. It reflects the main characteristic of our relations to European Union: lack of breakthrough steps, but continuation of some processes already started some time ago. And Mr. Leader, who is present here, he could agree that Brussels says that you Ukrainians do everything right, but with a slow pace. Again, another trace of this period is that Ukraine, in fact, is stomping on its own feet, means the anti-corruption reforms are slowed down, and no consequences of the buy Ukrainian, pay to Ukrainians laws like that are stuck. And we're speaking about continuation of already started processes rather than some breakthrough steps. So we are going closer to Ukraine-NATO relations. We decided to follow this direction last autumn, and of course it was good because we didn't know what it will be, if it will end up in the country aspirant status for Ukraine. So we many times hear that NATO doors are open for new members, but we have been rejected some 10 years ago, and now we have a partner with extended opportunity. So how to go through these NATO doors, Catherine? Shall we find any key? As I mentioned already, we have the period of country aspirant. What the main features of this period? We are speaking about the time span between the November 2017, beginning of February 2018. We are speaking about protocol issues, procedural issues, like the program has already been fulfilled or not fulfilled, and we had a line of meetings on this national annual program. So we may say now that the annual national program, according to the presidential administration, this program is being reconsidered and it is approved by the cabinet of ministers of Ukraine, and there is no quality we mentioned, because this program finally will be oriented on qualitative rather than quantitative indexes. So the intensity of work over Euro-Atlantic integration in many directions, this intensity is strengthening. So of course in the reported period we have a lot of very interesting political moves with plus and minus signs on nature. As Tamara already mentioned, we've already mentioned the country aspirant status for Ukraine. I would like to concentrate on this moment. And first of all, we're speaking about very symbolic status that, in fact, we may see in website of the NATO and political rhetorics. We are not speaking about certain official status that is stipulated by certain bilateral agreement or some type of document, like if we are speaking about European integration, we have a lot of status. Status the potential candidate to membership. We're speaking here only about the recognition of Euro-Atlantic intention of Ukraine, and this recognition already been made in our reported period. So we had a lot of statements, announcements from Ukrainian officials and politicians, from experts. So in many months, many people, they say Ukraine is not pursuing the aim, is not trying to enter into NATO membership. So when we were present in Munich Security Conference, Mr. President Poroshenko already sent a letter, very specific letter, that Ukraine is trying to get a NATO membership. We are speaking about Ukraine-Hungary dialogue. Unfortunately, it played its role, negative role, in relations between Ukraine and NATO. We are speaking about a lack of 2 meetings at ministerial level between Ukrainian and Hungarian officials. There are certain meetings in lower levels, and in the nearest future it's a danger for Ukraine that Ukraine could be not invited to NATO summit this July if we won't find a compromise between us and Hungary on some issues. It's not the only one condition. If we are speaking about invitation of Ukraine to that summit, it's not the only one. It's a political issue. We are speaking about bilateral Ukraine-Hungary dialogue as well. We have certain questions for some reforms, our obligations. First of all, we are speaking about the law on national security to be adopted and the reform of the Security Bureau of Ukraine, National Security Bureau of Ukraine reformation. So this is very old issue. It is included in the agenda. It was prepared 2 years ago, and since then the issue regressed to a certain extent, and the discussions somehow calmed down a little bit, and the draft document already was agreed between Ukraine and EU, but again it was sent to reconsider, sent to make certain amendments and changes, and this document, it hasn't been yet published, but again this already been, it is already not that good in its body that it was before. The previous edition was better. And one of the items in our agenda for 2018 that is expected by NATO and that is included into draft bill on the national security, this is an obligation to have Minister of Defense as a civil person, and until now it is not clear will it be stipulated properly, will the civil person could be a person that just retired from the army, or it will be cooling off period to be introduced here. So we are speaking about 5 years at least for this person to spend out of the active military service. Can we say a couple of words about the NATO standards? What NATO standards were speaking of, how can we get them? How can we understand if they are applicable to Ukraine? In fact, in the last program document in Ukraine, in strategic defense building, it is very clearly stated that we undertake to harmonize our environment with the NATO standards in this area until 2020. So the terminology and definition should be clarified here, because there's no clear understanding what are standards. We may speak about technical standards. There are about 1,300 of them, technical standards of NATO. Not necessarily all of that 1,300 are adopted in all the NATO members. Some countries, they adopt certain standards, certain are not adopted in their legislation. But what is interesting for us is that Ukrainian officials, they are speaking about very uneven progress or uneven intensity, uneven pace of fulfilling this or that actions. So Mr. Poltorak, Mr. Minister, already said about certain half of standards are adopted. Ukrainian ambassador to NATO, he said about 1/3 of the standards applicable, etc. So we don't have this monitoring, 100% monitoring of that. So we have different evaluations, different points of view in Ukraine. So we need to have a certain generic approach to evaluation of those standards and its applicability to Ukraine. We are not speaking about the adoption of technical standards and new legislation to be as well adopted. We need to have a mental evolution of approaches towards hierarchy in army, in armed forces, in standards of service, in defense issues. We must probably wait until next generation, so to say, will come. So now we have Q&A session. Please, if you have any questions, please. Probably all the questions are to be said in coffee break. So if it's okay, then please enjoy coffee, network, read our index, and wait for our next issues. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, speakers. Adjourned.
Чесно, по-моєму, все чудово, динамічно.